Classical music holds a unique place in the cultural fabric of humanity, embodying centuries of artistic tradition and intellectual rigor. It has the power to evoke profound emotions, inspire creativity, and connect us to the shared experiences of generations past. Yet, in a modern era, being an original composer in this field seems to be an uphill battle for numerous reasons. The landscape is often dominated by nostalgia for the old masters, your Mozarts, Beethovens, and Bachs, while contemporary composers strive to carve out a space that is both innovative and respectful of their tradition, but also original, not an easy balance. The challenge lies not just in the act of creation, but also in finding an audience willing to embrace something new and unconventional within the genre that's so incredibly steeped in history and so traditional at its foundation. Compounding this issue, I think, is the decline in music education across the globe, which leaves many young people without the tools to appreciate, much less engage with classical music. In Australia, less than 23% of schools offer a comprehensive music program, and the situation is equally troubling in Europe and United States. A recent study from the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States revealed that only 15% of students receive formal instruction in music. Similar trends are observed in the United Kingdom, where funding for arts education has plummeted by over 30% in the last decade. Without a foundational education in music, the next generation is less likely to explore or support the nuanced world of classical composition, leaving it vulnerable to further marginalization. Despite such profound challenges, the art of composing remains a vibrant testament to human creativity and ingenuity. Classical composers are not mere imitators of the past. They are innovators who bring a diversity of thought, culture, and emotion to their work. Each composer's voice is distinct, contributing to a rich tapestry of sound that contrasts sharply with the mass-produced and formulaic music that often dominates the airwaves and charts. Composers like Arvo Pärt, Sofia Gubaidulina, and John Adams remind us that the realm of classical music is as diverse and dynamic as ever, offering profound alternatives to the homogenized musical landscape of modern pop. Among this new wave of classical talent stands Alexander Voltz, an Australian composer whose work embodies both originality and reverence for tradition. Voltz's music has been performed, recorded, and celebrated both in Australia and internationally, earning him accolades and cementing his reputation as a significant voice in contemporary classical music. In 2022, he conceived and directed the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Concert, which was recognised by the Australian government as the Commonwealth's largest musical tribute to Her late Majesty Elizabeth II during her 70th year as the Queen of Australia. More recently, in 2024, Voltz achieved international acclaim by winning the Symphonic Category of the 19th George Enescu International Competition in Bucharest with his orchestral work Dunrossil Elms. Beyond composing, Voltz contributes to the cultural conversation as the founding music editor of the journal Quadrant, and through his regular writing for Sky News Australia and The Spectator Australia. His insight on music, culture and society are as sharp as his compositions, making him a multifaceted artist whose influence extends beyond the concert hall. Based in Brisbane, Alexander Voltz represents the pinnacle of modern classical composition, and his journey is a testament to the enduring relevance of this art form in the 21st century. Today on The New Orchard, we'll delve into Alexander's creative process, his inspirations, and his vision for the future of classical music. From the challenges of composing in a modern world to the triumphs that come from dedication and originality. I'm excited about this interview. Let's dive in. Alexander, can we start with a little introduction? I'm curious to hear from you what put you on the path you're on today. Did your parents inspire you to pursue music and consequently the career you are in today?
Well, my father is a musician, and that almost certainly pushed me in the direction of me becoming a musician. I thought maybe when I was in school that I would study law. I thought that I could see myself in a courtroom. I liked Law and Order growing up, but I do. I just got to that final 6 months of school and reasoned with myself that no, I'm too much of a musician. And by that point, I mean, I'd been composing by the time I was 8, I think. And I'd had works performed from young ages, and they're all very forgettable works and embarrassments. But the bug was sort of germinating in me from a young age. Yeah.
All right, let's get into it because I've got quite a lot of questions for you today. Let's start with this one. Many great composers like Beethoven and Mozart were deeply tied to the social and political climates of their times. How do you think the role of the composer has evolved since then, and how do you see yourself fitting into that evolving tradition?
Well, music is not above politics. That can sometimes be a misconception that's put out by conservative critics or conservative um, listeners or audiences, that music should somehow be divorced from the political. Uh, it's not divorced from the political. But where I draw a distinction is the value of a piece of music bears no relation to how political it is or it isn't. That's that's fundamental. So if we look at some of those great works, if you like, by Mozart and Beethoven, thinking on the fly, what might we consider a political work of Beethoven's? Well, a lot of people tend to mention the Ninth Symphony because it sets the poetry of Schiller, which has a very universal suffrage type uh, inclination about it, that all men are equal. Um, the text of Schiller's featuring in that piece is not why we remember Beethoven's Ninth Symphony today, all these years after its premiere. We remember it because it is objectively a great piece of music. It's a quality art. It's well crafted and it has a distinct Beethovenian style about it. That's why we remember it. And I see myself today certainly trying to inspire among artists and anyone who's interested in art the primacy of quality, the primacy of the idea that art is not something that is merely based on feelings alone. We may come to this in our conversation, and I hope that we do. Postmodernism has done a lot of damage to the world, in my estimation. Uh, the the notion that truth has been replaced by feelings has basically led to the degradation of critical thought. And because there's been this great degradation of critical thought, we're now very poorly equipped to evaluate what is good art and what is bad art. And we've come up with all sorts of shallow quantifiers for how we make that separation. A lot of the time it's political. A lot of the time in the field of music composition, it's tied to the extra artistic, the extra musical. For example, people say, well, Beethoven 9 is a great piece of art because of the text that it sets. No, Beethoven 9 is a great piece of art because its form is mathematically genius. Its orchestration is powerful and effective. Its unique style, its development of the symphonic literature to include a chorus is innovative but not wholly alienating to any listener. It's an example of a positive expansion in music. These things are objective. They're not informed by feeling, which is dominating too much of the way that we see art, simply because truth, I suppose, has come along and been replaced by it thanks to the legacy of postmodernism. So I see myself as certainly trying to encourage everyone to reevaluate how they think about music. Um, that's certainly what I've been doing. And I, of course, strive to write good music. Every composer does. I take comfort in the fact that the criticisms I impose on the broader society of composers. They're all imposed on my own work as well. So it's certainly as if I'm not being inauthentic about what I'm getting up to.
Would you say that you subscribe to beauty as a universal value or something that's subjective?
Well, this is fascinating because I probably would say that I don't know. Beauty is a mood. For me, beauty is a mood. Ugliness is a mood. Mysteriousness, a mood. Pensiveness, melancholy. These are sorts of descriptive language that we might apply to the very abstract art form that is music. And they are styles, if you like. They're aesthetic. They're one half of quality, with the other half being craftsmanship. Maybe to answer that question, it's good to define those two terms. Craftsmanship is technique. It's principally informed by mathematics and physics. And a really concrete example of that would be um, if you write a passage in the French horn, if you like, that's well above the treble stave, it's going to sound poor because the instrument's not equipped to handle that type of musical material. Uh, that would be an example of poor craftsmanship, for example, because it defies the laws of physics. And if you're a Star Trek fan, that's certainly a principal axiom that you take away. For performers, it's very easy to tell when they have poor craftsmanship. We know quite quickly when a violinist plays out of tune. So these things are more easily identified than when we look at a page of music and we have to evaluate whether it's well constructed or not. That's craftsmanship. Style is how the composer then, from that technique, because the technique is there's the basis, it's the building block to style, then creates something that is their own. Not necessarily uniquely their own, but as I've always argued, authentically their own. And within style, there are certain evocations that music can make, and these are the moods. Beauty is a mood. One problem that I have with Roger Scruton's work, who I am a tremendous admirer of, is that his emphasis on beauty doesn't necessarily consider that for something to be truly, truly euphorically beautiful, as we might consider that, it may need to be preceded by 10 minutes of bleak, desolate ugliness in music. Music moves through time linearly. You can't listen to music backwards, for example. And so what occurs early on in a piece informs what happens towards the end of the piece. And some of the great moments of the symphonic literature are only so powerful because they are so transcendental, transcending of what has come before, which often than not is not beautiful. It is material that is deeply grieved or deeply conflicted. Remember that in literature and in the art of writing, great narratives require conflict to be entertaining. The same is true of music to an extent. There has to be a coherent musical argument, a trajectory. I'm not sure if every piece of music should be always beautiful throughout that trajectory. However, I certainly am of the belief that any mood for any mood's sake is inadvisable. Simply writing 10 minutes worth of ugly music is not productive, I don't think. I don't think it has broad appeal. And similarly, writing 10 minutes of just beautiful music, well, art is about the highest form of the human expression, really, to me. High art is about that. And if you write 10 minutes of just beautiful music, does that maneuver your artwork into the realm of uh, an innocence that is, maybe a little shallow, a naivety, if you like? I'm not sure. These are deep questions that differ from artwork to artwork, piece of music to piece of music. But if gimmicks begin to form and composers are only writing ugly music or they're only writing beautiful music, I think it begins to say more about their command of their craft than it does anything else.
A small detour, because I was not planning to ask you this, but you've mentioned the destructive hand of postmodernism. What do you think makes this ideology so incredibly attractive to the masses?
That's a good question. And it's not a question that I can readily answer. I've struggled to answer it for such a long period of time now because it's always interested me. I've wanted to get to the bottom of what does drive this interest in postmodernity, what makes it attractive. I suppose if I lay out how I perceive postmodernism to have come about, we might begin to formulate a sort of answer. In the 70s, the 60s were an interesting time with the gender studies. Um, I think just as a caveat before we get going, the universities have got a lot to answer for. That would be my central uh, proclamation in all of this. The 60s were very attractive to the feminist ideology. The 70s and the late 60s and the 70s is when the French began to explore postmodernism as a theory. Now, postmodernism, it's not an unimportant philosophic light bulb moment, if you like. The idea that truth might not exist is certainly to be considered. Um, but I think that consideration has a lifespan of about 5 minutes because it's so unproductive, it's so nihilistic. But it was a new thought at the time. Commercial instinct drives a lot of these bad ideologies that end up floating around the world. And what tended to happen, I think, was the French went over to the American university circuit and they propagated their bad ideas throughout the university system. And as America has been the driving force of culture, may I say probably regrettably, since the 70s, it stands to reason that, at least among the Western speaking world and even the Anglosphere, at least the Anglosphere, I mean, the Eastern European countries are still doing a fairly good job of retaining their cultural idiosyncrasies. But because America is that dominant force in the Anglosphere, it's no surprise that the university doctrines that were informed by postmodernity have branched out. And the central tenet, as I've sort of touched on in that earlier response, is that truth doesn't exist. Now, the problem with truth not existing, or the skepticism towards grand narratives, is sort of a phrase they like to use, is what are you going to replace truth with to adjudicate disputes of knowledge that you have? That's the issue. Um, and the supreme answer that we've conceived has been feeling. Now, there's a few things about feeling. It's completely personal. It's not empirical. You can't test the legitimacy of a feeling. That's what makes it so attractive to the people who've appropriated it as a form to adjudicate knowledge, because they can't really be proven wrong. From this, the whole victimhood narrative, grievances historically, so on. This has all flourished out of feeling being this ultimate arbiter of truth. Um, I think that's an attractive proposition because it abdicates responsibility. It abdicates the need for the individual to be learned, to be well spoken, to be able to resolve their conflicts in a rational way. It encourages hedonism in the sense that you can do whatever you want, and that's okay because your feelings justify that. So you can act anyway. You can resolve disputes as irrationally as you like. That I think is the central attraction, and it's not even that this can be so appropriated to achieve political and ideological outcomes, which we've seen in the last 20 years of politics. Um, and of course, this is a huge, huge problem. But I think the deficit of courage in society actually stems from the fact that being a postmodernist is so easy. It's so easy to be relaxed and lazy and irresponsible, and someone else will take care of it, and my feelings are supreme. That probably is why the birth rate is declining so fast. I think that's certainly got something to do with it. And that's the other thing. I mean, the idea that little bits of knowledge in society, little arguments, disputes, that they occur um, independent, exclusive of everything else, is not true. What we've become very bad at in society, and particularly since the introduction of social media, I think, which has withered attention spans, is we've become very bad at looking at the big picture. And the big picture, it seems to me, the root of the problem within the big picture is postmodernity, because we've not undone it, we've only encouraged it, and it is now flourishing. And my generation is growing up with this notion that feeling is sovereign, if you like. Of course, feeling has merit. Of course, individuals are called to do different things. But they are called also to be responsible within a moral framework, whatever that moral framework might be. Um, and postmodernity has done a very good job of shattering that. That's what I think the appeal is. It's a laziness fundamentally.
Do you know who Ian McGilchrist is?
No, I don't know of him.
McGilchrist wrote this fascinating book which contains a thesis about the disrupted harmony of collaboration between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. I read this book last year while I was also taking a good look at the psychology of a person attracted to postmodern ideologies. Anyway, in the book, the author argues that the Western culture has increasingly favored left hemisphere's approach to mapping and understanding of the world. And that led to a cultural shift from a more holistic, embodied understanding of the world, that's the domain of the right hemisphere, to a more mechanistic, detached, and reductionist way of thinking about the world. That's the domain of self-referential left hemisphere. Then he goes on to talk about this shift having a profound effects on various aspects of human life, including art, science, religion, politics, and economics, leading to the loss of meaning, connection, and the essence of human experience. It's a fascinating book, and I recommend you take a look at it at some point.
I will certainly look it up. If you could send me the title of the book and the author, that'd be great. Thank you.
The book is by Ian McGilchrist, and it's called The Master and His Emissary. I should have said that at the very beginning. All right, let's move on. In an age of rapid cultural change, we live in this age of hyper novelty. What do you think it means for a piece of music to be timeless today? Is creating timeless music a goal of yours at all?
I think if you begin the creative process from that pursuit to be remembered throughout history, or for your work to be remembered throughout history, you've already lost the game. I think that it's just not something that an individual can certainly craft. Take Napoleon, for instance. Napoleon would be a good example of someone who certainly could engineer history to paint him favorably. He had a lot of dedicated supporters in his exile, and when he wrote all his books and histories of what his reign and life had been, he managed to disseminate those to disciples who went off and preached them. But that's really only a public relations job, I think. For a great work to be timeless, it has to be interesting, fundamentally. And my contention would be that an interesting piece of work is something that communicates the human condition in a high expression and in a way that is not easily replicated. That at least would be the artwork's innate qualities. But then there are so many artworks, at least in my view, that lie dormant in libraries where there's no champions of them. There are no champions of them. So timelessness in music, it's not a metric by which any composer can aspire to. I don't think. I don't think. All I think that we can do is behave as authentic artists who write quality music and leave the rest to God, pretty much. Now, we talked about quality earlier. Quality is both craft, which is technique, and style, which is aesthetic, and it's the sum of those two things. At least this is how I see matters, and I've certainly been trying to refine this language and the terminology throughout my tenure as the music editor at Quadrant. Authenticity is different. It's a different kettle of fish, and I was initially, even at the time of my honours thesis, was conflating authentic artworks and authentic artists. I don't actually think you can have an authentic artwork because authenticity is a state of integrity. It's a state of being, and artworks are inanimate. They rely on their finite objective parameters to communicate what they are fundamentally. Authenticity is a metric that we use to speak about artists and their motivations. That's crucial. A well-motivated, authentic artist, probably in my calculations, is more likely to produce a timeless work of art. And an inauthentic composer is less likely to do so. Now, the word authenticity gets a bad rap because it means all things to all people. The definition I've come up with, which no one has yet been able to shake me on, is authenticity is honesty grounded in knowledge. Honesty grounded in knowledge. Sometimes I get those two reversed. Is it knowledge grounded in honesty or honesty grounded in knowledge? The pursuit of knowledge to the authentic artist is a must. They are ever hungry to grow. They are ever hungry to learn. They want to know what others of the past and their contemporaries are doing. And in that sense, authenticity is very vocational. And you can get into the spiritual side of that too. But I do think that the very greatest of artists were not necessarily being driven just by their own prerogatives, put it that way. So the authentic artist is always searching for answers, wanting to absorb as much of history, work out, learn, study, become erudite, become knowledgeable. And then they use what they acquire honestly. So, for example, there are a lot of inauthentic artists, I think, out there who know that the music they are writing is trite and derivative and has been done before, but they continue to do it anyway because it's easier, it's commercially advantageous, perhaps. It's could be even all that they're capable of in some ways. And as I said earlier, if one person is writing in banality or ugliness or beauty all the one time, it suggests that says more about their technique than anything else. So I suppose that in summing up, the authentic artist is best positioned to create something that is timeless. But the authentic artist, in my view, wouldn't even set themselves the task of creating something timeless. They would just create something that was quality and adhered to their authenticity.
Have you seen a movie called Amadeus by Milos Forman?
That is a fantastic film.
Would it be fair to say that this movie is historically accurate?
Not so much. It's not so accurate. Salieri didn't poison Mozart. I don't think that was a rumor at the time, but it wasn't. It's not been founded historically. The film is based off a stage play by Peter Shaffer, I think. Yeah, so Peter Shaffer. It's great, but that film is great because in that film it so clearly evokes what it means to be a vocational artist. in both Salieri's terms and Mozart's terms. One is highly Christian, and the other is driven by a sense of secular, if you like, self-determination to succeed. But both are vocations. That film remains one of my all-time favorite films. I do watch it when I get the chance. And there's a reason it won 7 Oscars back in 1984 when the Academy Awards weren't what they are today. It's a tremendous film.
I love that film too, and I was wondering how accurate it is, as I've done very little reading about how the movie was made, or biographical reading about Mozart.
Mozart's impoverished life, that's all true. And his wife leaving him, that's all true, and all the the death of the children, that's all true, and some of the court relationships with the emperor and the impositions that were put on Mozart's music, that's all true. Yeah.
The reason why I've asked you about the movie is because of something you've said while answering my previous question about the deliberate intentionality to create timeless music. There are scenes in the movie where Mozart seems to be connected to some ephemeral divine place where his music originates. In some of the scenes, the music was coming to him so fast he was almost unable to transcribe it into notes. The process was portrayed as something very natural and, how do I say this, effortless. There was this stark contrast between him and Salieri, whose music in the movie was almost banal and trivial compared to what Mozart was creating. Salieri simply worked from a different set of motivations, and his work in the movie lacked originality. I mean, that's my subjective take from watching the movie a couple of times and not studying Salieri in any meaningful detail. But I was wondering what your take is.
Well, that's interesting. I suppose of Salieri and Mozart, you could say they were both driven by the metaphysical in their own ways. God works through Mozart in the film, and Salieri recognizes that he needs God to truly be a great composer. That's an interesting takeaway. Without the artist, there is no art. That's a true supposition. But that doesn't make the artist greater than the artwork. There's a sort of strange equilibrium there between the artist and the artwork. And Mozart was obviously gifted incredibly. Salieri was also gifted. But history hasn't remembered Salieri, and it has remembered Mozart. And I do wonder why that is. I mean, how did this, I don't know off the top of my head how this very poor man managed to, whose children did not survive him for long. His oldest son, I think, died quite young. How did his music continue to be shared amongst the world? I'm not sure. Music doesn't come from nowhere, however. If you believe in the metaphysical, inspiring artists, all the metaphysical can do, except in those very rare circumstances, and Mozart would be an example, Mendelssohn would be an example, some later musicians who were just so gifted and made it look so effortless, like Leonard Bernstein, for example. They're in the 1% of the 1%. The normal 1% has to work very hard, and I think the metaphysical inspires the conviction to which someone pursues their craft. It doesn't necessarily endow them with this perfection to begin with. For example, I struggle immensely to get through music. It's quite a struggle to write, and I've certainly written way more poor music and poor quality music and forgettable music than I have good quality music and music that might be remembered. But for me, you have to sort of do that to create the diamond from the rough, you know. So it comes through labor, but the resilience may be the thing that's less explainable.
All right, let's talk a little bit about pushing boundaries. The great composers of the past pushed the boundaries of form and harmony, What does innovation mean to you as a modern composer? How do you push the boundaries within your own work? And what do you think are the greatest opportunities for musical evolution today?
Well, this was what my honours thesis was on at university, and my central tenet was that you shouldn't necessarily be trying to push the boundaries. I think you've probably lost if that's something that you're trying to do right from the get-go, in the same way that you shouldn't be imitative from the get-go. Uh, you've got to write music that accords to your own motivations and inspirations and interests. And you do that authentically, as we've touched on. Now, there are some fundamental realities here. I think, in a simple answer to your question, you've got to pursue the excavation of the past and learn what has already been done and where there might be gaps in the future. Or where there might be current gaps that could lead you to fill them in the future. Without having done that, you're at a disadvantage, because what you then think could be highly original and innovative could have been done 50 years ago by John Cage, for instance. And goodness me, there are a lot of practicing musicians today who are of that belief that they're doing something highly original, but indeterminate music was popularized in the 50s and the 60s by John Cage. I think it's Douglas Murray who says something to the effect of, I'm sick of a lot of people projecting their ignorance onto the rest of us. And he then goes on to list a number of authors who are supposedly marginalized by today's standards. But it's certainly the case with music. There are people today who are coming up with all sorts of quirks and gimmicks. We call them gimmicks, they're, or in fact, may I say, crutches. They're crutches for poor craftsmanship. Sometimes they work, but to base one's whole oeuvre on them is a bit silly. I think with music, what we have to remember is that, for example, if a person writes a symphony and they title it Symphony, they are inviting the world to consider their symphony within an established body of literature, the symphonic repertoire. And you want to be pretty confident doing that, don't you? You want to be pretty confident to whack the word symphony on to a piece of music and then have it compared to the 9 of Beethoven, or the 9 and technically 10 of Mahler, and the 9 of Bruckner, the incomplete 9 of Bruckner, and all those symphonies from throughout time. Of course, I'm only listing just the first ones that come into my mind. You want to be careful doing that. The symphony is it's a great form of music. It's an established form of music. So you have to respect that, and you can certainly be innovative. Bernstein did prove with a fellow composer who was also a mathematician, I think he was a mathematician at one of the universities, that there is an infinite variety of music, at least speaking mathematically. There is an infinite variety of combination theories that you could come up with to create a piece of music. So music is infinite in its possibilities. Again, that's to be respected and explored, but it's not to be made a gimmick of. And I think fundamentally, again, boundaries, innovation, and so on, the very best thing that a person can do, insofar as I've described these terms, is to be authentic as an artist and then strive vocationally to create quality artworks. That I think is really all that anyone can do. And if you've got the knack for it, you may very well create something that's innovative. Being an artist is not like being a factory worker. And this is where government policy has gone so spectacularly wrong, in my opinion. Particularly the government policy at the moment. If you take a look at the federal government policy. I don't know if your listeners are international. We're, of course, in Australia, and I'm referring to the Commonwealth government's national cultural policy, which it very irresponsibly, I think, for a number of reasons that we won't go into, calls Revive, a place for every story and a story for every place. I can assure you it's not at all a policy document that looks out for everyone. But it positions the artist as a worker. And I think that's to misunderstand what art is. There's been a lot of emphasis on you've got to earn a living through your art. That may be a modern luxury. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that artists should be underpaid for the work that they do or anything like that. In fact, I've been a fierce advocate for making sure that artists are remunerated according to what they produce. But is commerce the driving form of art? Is it the driving force? I'm not sure. It certainly wasn't for many who composed against the odds. There's a great Swedish composer, Alan Peterson, who's not well known. But this was a man who was diseased, impoverished, politically exiled, just lived in absolute squalor, and yet he still found it within himself to write more than 10 symphonies from memory. I could have that wrong, but I think it's more than 10. I mean, what drove that man? He might have been better off getting a job as some sort of clerk or something that would bring in a stable income, or a grocer or whatever, if commerce was his driving vocation. But it wasn't. It was music. So yeah, that we're not workers. That's been a mistake. It's not to say that the artist is special. The artist is not elite or above the rest of the individuals in society of varying occupations and vocations. But it is a very abstract thing. And to equate it to being a factory worker, I'm not sure if that's been productive in the long run. And it's probably the case that because so many commercial incentives and even political KPIs are enforced on the arts today, that there is this preponderance towards, well, what are we going to do that's innovative? Or how are we going to push the boundaries? Or, well, my music is my symphony is not a symphony because it's a great piece of formal writing that expands upon an established and respected literature. It's a piece that explores the intersectional gender and racial differences between societies today. I mean, goodness me, that's a hell of a thing to say. And most of the time, the works that do that, they have trite harmonies and are poorly orchestrated and no craftsmanship about them. And, so.
The reason why I wanted to quiz you about innovation in music is because of something I've heard from Benjamin Zander a while ago. I think he was on a podcast and talked about Stravinsky intentionally experimenting with rhythm and dissonance upfront in his creative process.
Stravinsky is fascinating as a person whose style changes throughout time and or over the course of his life, put it that way. And he would have known that his earlier neoclassical music, which has often been described as saving Western art music from itself, that was far more popular and preconditioned to become timeless, let's say, than his later experimental atonal works. So the question is, why did he write those later experimental atonal works? And the answer to that question is simply because he felt compelled to do so. And again, is that commercially informed? I don't think so.
That's really interesting. Would you be able to walk us through your compositional process? Do you have any specific rituals or methods that help you channel both creativity and structure into your work?
I don't know if they're ritualistic. I do think I read somewhere that a composer's process or habits will save them from various psychological problems that they encounter, like imposter syndrome, or what's the other one that I'm thinking off the top of my head? Um, writer's block. That's it. So more like memory block for me. The processes do save you from those difficulties. As far as I go, I like to work with paper to begin with. Just a pencil and a paper. It doesn't even have to be lined manuscript music paper. But I am a big believer that the pencil is mightier than the computer mouse. The pencil is mightier than the mouse simply because the pencil can be manipulated in any particular direction that the artist would like to manipulate it in onto the page. Whereas the mouse within a software program does have a predetermined limitations of computational functions. There's only so much that you can do with a digital notation software, and you can do a lot. That's not to say that we're dealing with shall we say, shallow technology. We're not. But there's still not that infinity of the imagination within a computer program. So I start with the page. I work by hand. If it's a big work, I'll write a short score onto manuscript paper, or I'll just jot down ideas. And I have it's not music notation all the time per se. I mean, I might draw a squiggly line, for instance, and I certainly know how that will play out once I go to orchestrate or fill out this music. Where the computer for me has saved a lot of time, and because your listeners may not know, handwritten music is not at all accepted anymore in society, really. The publishers, performers, and so on, they want typed music that's been digitally engraved. Music used to be punched, but it's not anymore. And the composer is expected to produce high quality typeset parts and scores to their music. So for me, a lot of time has been saved by orchestrating into the computer. So what I mean by that is taking my, 2 or 3 piano staves of music, just a reduction if you like, and then extrapolating out that reduction in real time onto the full score into the computer. That saved me a lot of time. Structurally, I am also becoming very I was almost about to say dependent on, but I don't think I'm dependent on this. But I am very taken by graphing music. And what I mean by that is simply by plotting out with no real predefined criteria, plotting out the piece linearly. That has helped a lot and allows me to mathematically look at where the golden section, for instance, might be. I'm a big fan of the golden section in music, the golden ratio, and a lot of composers are a fan of this. They put their climax where it mathematically makes sense for their climax to fall in music. So sketching out things has really helped me. I think it's George R.R. Martin. In fact, it is George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, who says that there are two sorts of writers, and I think there's also two sorts of composers. There's architects and gardeners. Now, architects plan everything out and then begin to sort of sketch in the gaps as they go along. They get their umbrella, if you like, and then put the details in. I think fundamentally that could be me, for at least for my bigger works for orchestra. The gardeners cultivate their art in real time. They'll water it, they'll prune it, and so on. And I still do a fair amount of that, but I probably, for those bigger works, I do it at a micro level. I might, spend a lot of time gardening a phrase within my music, say 8 bars, if you like, growing that. But I've already sketched into my architecture where those 8 bars are going to fall. these systems help me. They don't help everyone. I work a lot from the piano as well. I have basic keyboard skills. I'm certainly not a pianist, but neither was William Walton. So that's my defense.
Yes, this is a good segue to my next question. Historically, composers were often performers, but today these roles are more
They were.
distinct. How do you see the relationship between the composer and the performer in your own music? Do you feel that the performers influence the ultimate outcome of your work?
So many could and so many couldn't. It is a very big advantage, I think, if in today's world you can be recording and performing your own music, particularly recording. There's never been more composers than there have been today. So it's already a very crowded landscape. And if you can differentiate yourself from the flock and become as independent as possible to a high level, you're well on your way to succeeding. I never had the patience for practice. It's funny, I have the patience for architecture and sketching things out, but I think it could be because I'm a perfectionist. And I don't mind spending time workshopping all the particulars when I know that inevitably they can be workshopped. There is still a large degree of chance in performance, isn't there? I suppose. Your string could snap or something. But I just didn't have the discipline for that. So I put myself at a disadvantage. And if I had my time over again, yeah, I would have reconsidered concentrating on my performance, if only to enhance my composition. I played viola at university. That was my chief study, and I did that to an amateur level, if you like. I still had some great opportunities to play some great music and to play aside some great musicians actually, and play in other countries, in China and Germany and America, and I enjoyed that. Um, but I was a bit of a terrorist of the viola section, I think. Some will remember my intonation used to receive a lot of strange looks. But I don't know if it's a necessity to be able to perform and compose. As I say, William Walton wasn't, and for me that would be the most inspirational um, composer who really was no performer. I love English music, I really do, and I love Walton's music, and the complexity of Walton's music seems to me to have been no way impeded by the fact that he was not a performer. Um, but do I think it's helpful? Certainly.
Your works are known for their emotional power. In an age where digital composition tools are widely used by a lot of composers, how do you ensure that your music maintains its emotional authenticity? And what role do acoustic instruments play in this?
Oh, that's very interesting. Acoustic instruments, I think, are more representative of the human condition because they are a kind of technology, but they're imperfect. They require the performer to produce sound from them. They're still very human, if that makes sense. They're not programmed. I was reflecting on this the other day. Do you remember, and you remember music by both, so this is why it's a good example, but do you remember more of the tunes and the music of John Williams, who wrote almost exclusively for the orchestra? Do you remember the soundtracks to those films, or do you remember the soundtracks to Hans Zimmer films, which are largely sampled?
I'd have to say probably John Williams' soundtrack to Star Wars than any of Zimmer's compositions, but that's because I grew up on the trilogy and must have watched those movies about 100 times, if not more.
But do you think the music is actually such a defining feature of the film? It's not a option.
I mean, that soundtrack is at least 50% of the movie.
It's not an optional extra.
No.
Movies, of course, stem from opera. Movies are cinematic opera. Star Wars, for example, speaking of John Williams, is so successful because it's basically a filmed space opera. And music that's created then in this, again, according to this legacy, and the legacy has always sought to express the human condition. Therefore, it seems to me that musical instruments that are more human fundamentally can achieve that goal better. That's what I would say. I'm not. Look, there's been no interest for me to explore electronic music. I've had no interest in that in my life to date. I'm not ruling it out, but I've not been captured by it. It probably would be commercially a sensible thing for me to do, but it doesn't interest me. And I think fundamentally it doesn't interest me is because I don't feel that it's ultimately what my art form is about, insofar as I've articulated that with the human condition and striving to express that.
Alexander, you live in Australia. How has living in this country shaped your compositional voice? And do you see any particular cultural influences present in your work?
I do, and I'm very proud to be inspired by Australia, which is my country. I am of the nationalist school of Australian composition. There are two loosely defined schools of Australian composition. There is the national school, which I'll discuss in a moment, and then there is the broader pan-international school that is, shall we say, pretty much in direct opposition to nationalism as a form of cultural aesthetic. Um, Nationalism isn't fascism, by the way. I just want to put that precursor on what I'm about to say because, again, it's so lazy an argument for people to come along and say, well, you're a nationalist, you must be this, that, and the other. I mean, that's ridiculous. Our nation or our society is organized into a nation state. Therefore, it stands to reason that the nation state might have some impact on how our culture is shaped. And I think that that's very true. So, my greatest mentor composition is a composer by the name of Brenton Broadstock, who was the chief professor of composition at the University of Melbourne for about a period of 30 years. He's a fantastic Australian composer, has written, I think he's up to his seventh or eighth symphony now, and an excellent musical voice, known right across the world. He studied with a man called Peter Sculthorpe. Peter Sculthorpe is Australia's greatest composer, past and present. He died in 2014, but there has been no one quite like him. At the time of his death, Tony Abbott, as Prime Minister, even reflected on what Sculthorpe's music had sought to do, which was render into music the Australian landscape and the Australian larrikinism and all these sorts of Australian things. Sculthorpe was very inspired by geography. He was very of his place and of his time. He still drew influence from traditional forms of Japanese and Indonesian music, but he molded that stimulus into a uniquely Australian idiom, which he described as being flat. He thought that Australia was a very flat country. He thought that our speech was flat. I've always thought of Sculthorpe as being a kind of Edward Elgar or a Charles Ives within the Australian musical journey. Elgar, of course, put Britain on the map as sort of the grandfather of what English music could be. And up until that point, English music had been driven a lot by the European continent. Charles Ives was a huge advocate for American folk song and used American folk music in revolutionary ways, actually, with stacking all different sorts of music on top of each other to create this sort of cacophony of sound that he thought was reflective of the American experience and psychology. And My point is that without someone like Elgar, you don't probably get a Vaughan Williams later down the track, who then pioneered what it meant to be from the English pastoral school of composition. Or a better example, which is why I mentioned Charles Ives, you probably don't get an Aaron Copland without Charles Ives. Copland, of course, famous for ballets, Billy the Kid, Fanfare for the Common Man. That would be um, probably the most well-known music of his outside of a musically informed audience. As far as Sculthorpe goes, I see him as the precursor, and I'm certainly trying to take what I can learn from Sculthorpe and create, as Copeland and Vaughan Williams did with their precursors, create an Australian sound. I am in quest for that. Because I'm inspired by my country. It's not because I'm obligated to be. That's the wrong way of it. But I am inspired, and I have a great affection for Australia. I think it's a great country. I think it has an enormous potential. I think it's come so far, and I'm very optimistic for its future. I really am. So I'm forever trying to put that landscape into sound. Of course, one of the problems that we have had is that certain special interest groups, predominantly of a race-based nature, put it that way, have sought to appropriate the Australian landscape purely for their own artistic mediums, which incidentally they still conduct through Western artistic forms. It's very rare that you hear a symphony for 100 didgeridoos. So, but I am in quest for that Australian sound, and it's something I am driven by. I'm not ashamed of it. I like it. I like my country. The work that has just won this award in Romania is a work called Dunrossil Elms, as in the elm trees, and it takes for its inspiration, although maybe it bears no musical resemblance. I'm not one to talk about what my music means. I think that's entirely in the eyes of the listener. I have my motivations and my personal interpretations, but I don't inflict those on other people. But the title of the work is From the Elm Trees That Line the Road to Government House in Canberra. And I'm forever inspired by these sorts of things. The piece I wrote for the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra in 2020 as part of their Emerging Composer program, that was called Capitol Hill. It took as a loose inspiration Parliament House and the state of politics in this country and so on. So these I'm interested in these things. I'm not really interested in exploring historically accurate sounds from the Ming Dynasty in China. I'm just not interested by that internationalism. I'm not interested by schools of music in Geneva or Berlin. It doesn't drive me. Yeah.
Classical music obviously has a very rich history, but today's cultural landscape is completely dominated by popular music. How do you view the role of classical music in contemporary context? How do you view it today? Do you think it's becoming more niche, or can it still hold a significant place in our modern culture?
It definitely can, and it definitely should. The reason it's becoming niche is because standards of music education in this country for children are appalling. They really have, again, central to our theme, abdicated all quality controls, abdicated the teaching of empirical knowledge, and come up with this half-baked, really something that's quite illiberal, informed by feelings that children in classrooms can go off with their acoustic guitars and do whatever they want. They're not Children aren't taught music properly. Because children aren't taught music properly, and look, that was more or less a rather banal example, but this is a complicated problem, and it will take too long to go into it. So you'll just have to except that music education in Australia is very bad. And your listeners will, I'm sorry, but it'll make me too angry. but it's very bad. But the problem is here that the next generations of Australians aren't being educated to value music. They're walking out of school with prejudices against classical music or art music. That's problematic because it reduces the number of clientele that the legacy cultural institutions in this country might one day have. Humanities education in schools, on the whole, is very bad. I mean, the museums are largely, the museums, orchestras, art galleries. These institutions are not attracting huge public interest. Um, I would like to think that they could be, but they've done such a good job of alienating most of the public from themselves, and couple that with the fact that the young generations of the public going through the education system aren't being taught to value them. Legacy institutions are in a whole world of pain, and they know it too. They're not letting on publicly, but they're very worried. At least that's what I can gather. So, do I think that art music should have a role in society? Yes, absolutely. I think that acoustic, contemporary art music or Western music or music in general, quality music, let's put that caveat on it, has been proven scientifically to enhance neurological pathways within the brain. So leave behind the whole exploration of the human condition and what sort of psychological and mental comforts or challenges or transcendence that might bring. Leave behind the spiritual element, leave behind the abstraction that music can't be put into words, and that's actually what makes it so valuable for times that we are speechless. It clearly has scientific benefits. So the more the merrier. But it faces some logistical challenges, education, operating costs. One thing I would like to say is the reason that there are not as many, or at least it seems to me, but I really think I'm right to say this, the reason that there are not so many performances of music by orchestras in, say, a season, if you like, is because the orchestras are employing an insane number of bureaucrats when they could be employing more artists, staging more productions, and doing that in ways that work economically viably, of course. But the number of bureaucrats employed, for example, you're broadcasting out of Melbourne. I think the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra at one, it might have been the 2023 annual report, which was the last one I read. I think between full-time and part-time bureaucrats employed something like over 70, with multiple people in the artistic planning department. I mean, how hard is it to plan a concert? At least to program a concert. I mean, once upon a time, we didn't even have these things called artistic directors. The conductors used to do it. And honestly, I think that privilege should be given back to the conductors and the players. But nowadays, you have people who sometimes are very good musicians who, for personal circumstances, couldn't secure a creative practice career, if you like, a performing career, or sometimes who are just complete dropouts of the humanities faculty, deciding what it is that these very good quality musicians will play. And they're deriving their $100,000 a year to do so, or $150,000 or $200,000 for some of the senior leadership positions. It's ridiculous. You could axe that senior leadership position and put on, a concert with that sort of money, 200 grand. That's actually about what it costs, because I looked into hiring an orchestra at one point. And it's about for a concert to hire the venue and to hire the orchestra for the number of rehearsals that they'll need, and even this is just for one performance, mind you. The orchestra alone is about $125,000. Now, the venue on top of that is about, depending where you are, let's say Sydney Opera House, you're looking at about 50 to 70. So you're already in that 200,000 ballpark. It's incredible. It's incredible. And that's, that's not taking into account exorbitant soloist fees, exorbitant conductor fees, marketing fees, and so on like that. It's quite incredible. So there is a role for these things. There has to be. I believe there has to be. But working out exactly how we logistically salvage those roles is the great challenge of the time. And for me, it begins with quality. We must reassert the primacy of quality, because once we do that, or quality and inauthenticity, or quality and stamping out inauthenticity, I mean to say, because once we reassert the primacy of quality, then the artworks that we present to the public, or music education, for instance, that will take care of itself. Okay, we'll be presenting high quality things. That's good. And once we take care of the authenticity, we'll be motivated to present the quality. And our music educators will be quality educators. And our bureaucrats within our legacy cultural institutions, I'm not making the case to purge all bureaucrats. You obviously need someone to run the accounts team and that sort of thing. You do need that a little bit. Will be authentic individuals, and they'll be positioning themselves towards quality. But just one last point on this sort of thing. The Australian orchestras are run as they're run like the regional orchestras of Great Britain. They have boards. They're independent kind of entities. They have taxpayer funding. They have private philanthropy and so on. And it's kind of a top-down leadership approach. The London orchestras are notable because something like the London Symphony Orchestra is what's called a self-governing cooperative. The players actually meet regularly in committees to decide who they will work with, what music they will play, what music they won't play, what music the people they won't work with. This is important. I do think that giving the orchestral musicians and chief conductors in residence the autonomy to make these artistic decisions away from the bureaucracy is probably what we need to start doing in Australia. I think a lot of the poor quality choices that we're making in the music world will begin to very quickly disappear because there are a lot of musicians in orchestras who are deeply dissatisfied with some of the new music they have to play, some of the ways in which they go about staging concerts according to government KPIs and certain ideological flavors. They are deeply dissatisfied, but you can't blame them necessarily for not saying anything because it is their livelihood. And there's not that many jobs in Australia, or at least posts with secure financial outcomes that are available to orchestral musicians. Generally, they have to go abroad. So these things, they do have a place, yes. They have a place. We've got to find how we can help them to survive, because I believe that their survival is instrumental to the human condition. Yeah.
You are quite right about the exaggerated and somewhat excessive role of the administrator. This seems to have contaminated not just the music industry in the context you are describing here, but I would say, broadly speaking, majority of both corporate and governmental structures. Just look at the universities and the insane number of administrators on fairly high salaries. If you take academia as an example, you have to put a bit of a blame at the feet of the teachers who have gradually over time, I think, ceded some components of their role to an administrator, initiating this strange runaway process. Teachers have bought into this wrong idea that they need an administrator to perform a more mundane task they themselves don't have time to deal with. There's a fantastic editorial written about this topic titled When the Mismanagerial Class Destroys Great Companies. It's written by Marko Jukic, who wrote it for Palladium magazine. I'll pop a link into the show notes as it's such a well-composed indictment of the managerial and administrative class and its negative impact on general performance of a company or an institution.
But is that not the legacy of postmodernity, to abdicate the responsibility and to give up your control is to make yourself a master to another man? So I mean, they of all people, the university professors, should have realized what was going on, and they shouldn't have been so lazy and irresponsible.
Indeed, it would be hard to disagree with that. I want to ask you, do you believe in the idea of progress in music, where new works build on or improve upon the past? Or do you think that great music stands apart from such linear thinking? How does this idea influence your own approach to composition?
I think it does stand apart, yes. I don't think, again, with timelessness and progress and these sorts of things, that they're necessarily motivating themes for the authentic artist. I think the authentic artist is just chiefly worried about being authentic. That is what I think. I suppose the broader caveat is that the nature of human civilization is not one of linear progression, even in the West. Technology has evolved, but then some cultures haven't always had access to technology. For example, look at the Dark Ages in Britain and continental Europe in the early or the early Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages. At the same time, is that the Dark Ages? I can't remember. I'm talking about 800 AD or 700 AD. I mean, Europe has been pillaged by the Vikings, put it that way. I mean, compare those societies to, at exactly the same moment in history, the Islamic Caliphate in the Middle East, which is undergoing a golden age and which has amassed for itself a wide swath of land all the way throughout the Middle East, all the way along northern Africa into Iberia, and is technologically very developed. The Muslims at that time put a huge emphasis on translating the Greek works, which the Christians had not necessarily been too keen to do, because they considered that those works were, and in sometimes, well, it was a blasphemous act, I think I'm right to say. And the Muslims were a little more pragmatic, and so that helped them to evolve. But the point of that story is that different sorts of civilizations, and it's still very true in our world today, can be at different places technologically. So progress is not linear, even in the moment, or even in a global sense in the moment. And it's certainly not linear across the continuum of human history. I mean, I don't necessarily think that anyone would describe the First and Second World Wars as terribly progressive moments in the history of the West. They're probably quite catastrophic moments, and what's come out of them and what continues to affect us today remains quite catastrophic. For example, we were talking about nationalism earlier. Well, one of the great problems of the Second World War is the legacy has been that if you display any hint of nationalism or pride in your country, you must immediately be a Nazi, and that's not true. So, do I think that progress is an informing concept within art? Certainly people try to be progressive, but if they focus on quality, they're going to end up being progressive anyway. In the non-ideological sense of that word, they're going to make a unique contribution to art that expresses the human condition in an idiosyncratic way. That's important. Yeah.
The concept of beauty is central to classical music, but many contemporary works challenge traditional notions of it. How do you define beauty in music, and do you think it's still a relevant pursuit for composers today? How does this concept manifest in your work?
This is fascinating because we've talked about beauty in terms of its relationship to other musical moods, we've probably stopped quite short of defining what beauty actually is. And thinking on the fly, I just don't know if I can define it. Beauty for me has a sort of optimistic euphoria about it. That is perhaps in stark, even binary opposition to the pessimistic euphoria that might stem from ugliness, put it that way. In my music, at the very least, I do, at the climactic moments of my more significant works, certainly strive for a euphoric moment, if you like. There's a fascinating, I can't remember if Ravel actually articulated this, but a lot of conductors will tell you that if you listen to the Daphnis and Chloe, so the second suite of Daphnis and Chloe, the ballet by Maurice Ravel, at the there is one moment in the sort of sunrise depiction of that ballet, which is just orgasmic, really. It's just this great moment of the world sort of opening up, and it's not easily describable, that this sense of emotion being washed over you. Musicians will seek to find that, performers particularly, for 20 years. And once they find it, they feel the whole 20 years of their life has been justified. Another excellent example would be probably in the final movement of the Second Symphony, the Resurrection Symphony of Mahler, where there is just this incredible, indescribable glory basking in E flat major with the choir and the orchestra. It's just incredible. And this sort of euphoria, if you like, is inherent to so many great pieces of art, some of which are known, some of which are not known. I think beauty is that. I do think beauty is that, but it's a mood. I mean, what is a mood then? I suppose you have to ask if you want to define beauty. The interpretation of an artwork is something that's always fascinated me. I said earlier in this interview that I resisted putting words in other people's mouths. I'm a big fan of the transactional theory that was pioneered by an American literary critic called Louise Rosenblatt. I've always thought that this was a good way for interpretation to be transacted. Basically, transactional theory states that there exists a text or an artwork or a piece of music in our case, and that piece of music has a characteristic to it, a quality, certain small parameters which contribute into a larger work. And based upon the signals, if you like, that this is the work is throwing up, the reader will transact meaning from the text. And some transactions are more accurate than others based on the inherent properties of the text. But ultimately, it is the interpreter, not the interpreted, that is the operative agent. This is a theory that goes beyond, say, the structuralist theories of the postmodernists, for example. Who would be a good example here? Saussure or Derrida, or that sort of thing, because it vests the authority of the transaction not in the text but in the transactor, the listener, the reader. That's important because, that's important. So I've thought that's a good way to evaluate what an artwork is for an audience member as well. Yeah.
Do you know what? I have been thinking about the universal definition of beauty when talking and interviewing architects as well. Traditionally, beauty in classical music is associated with, I think, two things: harmony and aesthetic pleasure. Then take somebody like György Ligeti, who really challenges these traditional notions. And I think his idea of beauty is noise and dissonance. I happen not to mind his works, as he composed a few incredibly interesting pieces for Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey, which happens to be my favourite movie. Where I'm trying to go with this is ask you about the position of the universal. I'm definitely leaning more towards the classical model, if I can call it that, where beauty is so easily and somewhat instinctively recognizable. When it's there, it's really there, and one can feel it really deeply. I'm not quite sure what I'm asking you here.
Yes.
It's a not particularly well formulated
No.
question.
Yeah. Well, beauty is not. Beauty cannot be ideological fundamentally. Um, it can't be. It can be a state of being. It can be a stasis, but it can't be a prescription. This is where I think conservative advocates and critics often go wrong. They have a construction of what beauty is in their mind, and then they impose it on everyone around them. And I don't think that that's I don't think that that's necessarily I don't think that that's productive. I don't think that that's true art. I don't think that that's true music making. A lot of people will find beauty in sorrow and and utter desolation. And again, it's these moods that mean things to different people, really. Uh, Someone once, it's an anonymous quotation, I think, but this is so telling, actually. This is so relevant to our discussion. Writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And the premise of the quotation is to suggest that music isn't a language, so don't try and make it one. There was a great Australian music educator, the last great Australian music educator, I almost would say, called Richard Gill, who always, when he would give a talk, and I was fortunate to see him once and even play under him, he conducted an orchestra I was playing in once. But he said, "How do you say I want a cup of tea in music?" You can't. Music has no semantic meaning other than the meaning that is transacted by the listener. It has no meaning. I think that's a fantastic way to think about music. It's not a language, so don't try and make it one. And be wary of people who are trying to ascribe words to describe your music rather than simply listening to it. The reason that we articulate moods in music is fundamentally to shape our musical interpretation. It's not fundamentally, I would say, to be able to describe what a piece of music is on the paper. It's so that we can formulate what the music is in our mind and then execute it musically. Uh, this is a great mistake that has been made. I'm going to come back briefly to the music education's problem in Australia. One of the worst things that the Keating government did, and I can assure you they did a lot of bad things, but they, as part of the Dawkins Revolution, shut down the independent conservatoriums of music and the arts colleges and amalgamated them with the universities. Now, the great problem with this, fundamentally, is that music is a craft-based discipline. It is not a research-based discipline. It does not deal in words, it deals in art and product and performance. It's a trade in a way, it's a craft. And so now you've had, in order to satisfy funding grants and certain ideological agendas that have come out of the universities, all of which have been, the majority influence has been postmodernism. You've had people imposing research and language onto music and description. Now, music can suggest a lot. It can suggest a lot of moods that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but it cannot fundamentally explore a concept. It can't do that. It can only explore a concept if the listener imposes the concept and its exploration onto the piece of music. That is the problem that we've got. I can't remember how we got there, but putting the music, I mean, beauty, ugliness, pensiveness, mysteriousness, all these sorts of descriptors at the end of the day, what is their purpose? That's a good way of asking it. What is their purpose? Well, they exist so that musical interpretations may be better formed in one's mind, in a language, in a system of communication that one can identify with. And then that musical interpretation is executed. And it may be beautiful to one person. One person's beauty may be another person's ugliness. You never know. And it depends a lot on the psychologies of people. The last thing to add to the discussion of beauty, you spoke of harmony. I think melody as well is a very beautiful construction. I think it's a parameter of music that has been lost, but melody is a very human thing because the genesis of melody is out of singing and what the human voice could do. And melodies, successful melodies, are melodies that are memorable because they can be sung. This to me is a very beautiful thing, but then sometimes for Ligeti, there was a different conception of beauty, or whoever, and melody wasn't always involved. I've always placed great emphasis on harmony, personally. I've always thought that perhaps the greatest solution to the present problems that we have in music could be a restating of the importance of harmony. It is harmonic language and the way that harmonies work in music have always, for me, been more evocative than melodies, personally. Sometimes very simple melodies can be transformed by the most sublime of harmonies, and suddenly that simple melody is taken to new heights that you just wouldn't imagine. So harmony, I think, is another musical parameter that could be very tied into beauty. But then harmony can also be very ugly and desolate, and it's not clear to me that there's a blanket rule for everything. These moods, it's just not clear.
That's a very interesting point of view. I wanted to ask you, because you've won a couple of big awards
Sure.
over the years. Has winning these awards boosted your creativity in any way at all? What has it done for you? And do you consider winning awards at least a partial objective when composing music?
My honest view is that, well, before my honest view, the reason I enter competitions is I've always just enjoyed them. I'm a competitive person. I found that you create a good piece of art if you're working towards something, and there's a hope there that you might be rewarded with an achievement or a success. And I've always just liked competitions. That's why I participate in them. And I can assure you, I've lost many more competitive opportunities than I've ever won. And competitions are also an excellent way of building resilience, which is a very needed commodity in this arts trade. I see so much in the music world and the arts world that I think we could do better upon, and I think everyone wants us to do better. I think they want greater art. I think they want more authentic artists who are driven by knowledge and honesty, and they want craft, and they want style, and they want expressions that will stimulate the human condition, and they certainly don't want this ideological flavor, this grievance, if you like, that's now a kind of genre within art, genre of grievance. I mean, how preposterous is this? As I said at the beginning, art is not above politics. It's very much political, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And a good piece of art, to sum out what we've been talking about, is not defined by the identity of its creator. It is not defined by how political it is. It is not defined by any of its extra musical characteristics or extra artistic characteristics. It is simply defined by the objective parameters which construct it and which the listener or the reader or whatever the transactor is to the piece of art can transact from it to achieve some sort of meaning. That's really a summation of many of the philosophic and aesthetic matters that we've talked about tonight.
I'm very mindful of time, Alexander. We've been recording for almost 2 hours, so I'm going to ask you this last question. Looking towards the future, how do you envision classical music evolving? Do you think the tradition will remain recognizable, or do you foresee dramatic changes in how it's composed, performed, or even understood? What role do you hope to play in that evolution?
Well, the big game changer, or at least what people are touting as the game changer, and I might qualify that in a second, is artificial intelligence. I'm interested in artificial intelligence, but not because I see it as a threat. I actually see it as separating the wheat from the chaff. A lot of the, it's a strong word, but I'll use it, frauds in our industry or within our medium of artistic creation will turn to AI as a crutch, and also AI will become a dominant I'm trying to find the right word. I want to say language, but it's not language. It could be aesthetic. The AI aesthetic will become dominant, at least for a brief period of time. Those who resist it and who continue to create their quality artworks informed by authenticity will actually end up generating a very niche product, artistic product, and that will become very recognizable. So I'm not worried about that. I'm also not worried about AI really until AI, if it ever, and I don't understand how this could ever eventuate. So I'm going to say it's impossible, but maybe it could. I don't know. If AI ever formulated consciousness, right now it can mimic and it has intelligence, but it's not conscious. Until it has consciousness, it's not so much of a problem. But there's a broader philosophic argument here. What is the purpose of AI in a generative artistic sense? Earlier tonight, we referred to the infinite possibility of music, mathematically speaking. Now, let us envisage that as a galaxy, a universe. And AI can accelerate our exploration of that universe, one galaxy at a time. But because the universe is infinite, it can never truly map it all out. And I just wonder, what is the purpose of accelerating that process of discovery? Is it not the case that, to use another word we've been talking about, the beauty of art is in its human elements of discovery? The great innovations of art have come as light bulb moments to human beings, not necessarily to machines. I do wonder if there's this impatience to explore something that is ultimately infinite could end up backfiring. I think that it could. And I also fundamentally think that art that is generated by a machine, once you know that it's generated by a machine, you're not so interested in it, because art is about the human condition, not about machine computation. And you may struggle to tell the difference if it's deceptively portrayed to you down the future. And that's a separate matter which relates to authenticity, doesn't it? Because authentic artists and arts practitioners are honest. So they'll identify that if they're authentic, if they're using AI learning and so on to create their art. But once you find out that it's not by a human, I don't think it has much appeal, personally. It certainly doesn't to me. And I think that in terms of anything else beyond AI as being a challenge, it's just that logistical, that commercial, that educational conundrum and conundrums that we've been talking about that are really related to broader society, the effects of postmodernity on society. And once we cure those, because I believe that we can cure that with responsibility and authenticity, once we cure that, we'll be okay. We'll be in a better place to have art and have more quality art. And that will be an exciting time, particularly in this country, which I don't think we've properly explored yet. But as I say, I'm very uh, um, optimistic for the future. I'm very optimistic for the future. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying about AI. Where things are going to go, I think, is very much towards some kind of an oversaturation of AI generated content, which so far for me lacks any type of originality. It's been so banal and so predictable seeing all these AI clips pop up on different platforms. Do you think that oversaturation will, after a short period of hype, lead to a revival of human generated art and content?
Yes, I do. I mean, look, the AI phenomenon is going to have its dot-com bubble moment very shortly. Probably around, I would say, 2026, 2027. There's going to be a huge, at least I would bet there will be a huge economic downturn around that moment. A lot of these companies that have overborrowed to create experimental technology are just going to collapse completely. There'll emerge a few dominant players in that scene, um, and they will inform, much of what those future years beyond that looks like. But I do think we are already getting dangerously close to the point of maximum saturation with social media, uh, with the news cycle. Goodness me, the news. Who would have thought that the news could become a form of entertainment? That's what it is. The news is one big story now with no conclusion. There's no final chapter to the news. It's just conflict after conflict after conflict to create interest, to sustain entertainment, to drive incomes and commercial profits. That's what news has become. Um, so, look, there's plenty that we don't know about in the future. I mean, if we could foresee it, it would not be unforeseen, would it? But but I still I still place an enormous amount of faith in the individual and the individual's ability to overcome adversaries. What we probably forget is the individual has to go through the adversary first to overcome it. It's that parable of the prodigal son, really. The return to the father can't happen until the bad choices have been made. And as I say, in Australia, for 15 years or so, we've made bad choices at least a domestic policy level. Um, but I think people are beginning to see that those choices were poorly made, and we're beginning to do something about it.
Very good. Alexander, where can people find you and where can they listen to your music?
Well, despite my aversions to social media, I'm all over it. I'm all over it. I've not had an enormous amount of music recorded yet, and that's probably the result of some of the challenges that I spoke about earlier. But you'll find me on Facebook, you'll find my website, you'll find me on Wikipedia even, and plenty of links from there. So um, I'm there to be found.
Great. We're going to put all the key links into the show notes so people can easily find you. Alexander, you are a fascinating person, and it has
I
been a
appreciate
privilege to have you on the New Orchard Show today. I feel like I could be talking to you for another 5 hours. You've made it quite effortless for me.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. I think at the risk of flattery, but I think what you're doing is so vital, particularly for someone like me and my generation. And thank you for doing it. I know it's probably been um, economically draining, and certainly is draining your time being up so late in Melbourne now. And so I'm just very grateful to be a part of it. I hope that you get a lot of traction with this, and I'll certainly, once the podcast comes out, do my best to promote it too.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Alexander.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Take care.
Well, I hope you enjoy listening to Alexander Voltz as much as I've enjoyed interviewing him. He's a fascinating guy. I'm excited to see how his career is going to play out over the next few years and decades. As always, please do take a look at the show notes where you will find all the key links and references from the interview. I've also included Alexander's email address if you fancy reaching out to him directly. The music you've heard under my introduction monologue and the music you're hearing now was composed by Alexander Voltz and is titled Prayer for a Lost Friend. Alexander composed and dedicated this piece to a friend of his who sadly and tragically passed away in an awful climbing accident in 2021. The piece is slightly over 11 minutes long, and Alexander has given me a permission to let it play out until the end. Thanks for your attention today, and see you next time.